Stop for a moment and imagine this. What if one of the most unbelievable, spine-chilling stories in American history isn't the one we learn in school, but one that was buried, scattered in forgotten documents, faded letters, declassified files, and the trembling memories of the few who survived it? What if the United States, long before it was a superpower, stood more than once on the razor's edge of catastrophe, and the only reason the nation still exists is because of a chain of accidents, coincidences, and ordinary people who made impossible decisions at impossible moments? This is the story of America's hidden clockwork, how the nation nearly died again and again without the public ever truly knowing. The story begins not with a president or general, but with a cold January morning in 1801 in a dusty storage room beneath the partially built Capitol building. A clerk named Elijah Harrow, working by candlelight, discovered a box of sealed correspondence sent from frontier commanders, territorial legislators, and obscure local judges. These letters told stories of strange disappearances in Ohio, unexplained military movements in Spanish Louisiana, whispers of plots in New England, and a rumored conspiracy that powerful men in Europe believed could fracture the young republic before it reached maturity. Elijah didn't understand the importance of what he held, but history would. For buried inside those letters were the earliest seeds of something America would encounter repeatedly over the next 2 centuries, a recurring pattern of crisis, part negligence, part ambition, part pure accident that shaped the fate of the nation. Elijah's life changed the moment he found the letter dated December 29, 1800. The ink was smudged, the handwriting frantic, written by a frontier officer stationed at Fort Greenville, an isolated post where rumors spread faster than fire through dry grass. The officer claimed that scouts returning from the forests of the Northwest Territory had seen a metallic flash glide across the night sky, followed by a thunderous impact somewhere near the Great Black Swamp. He wrote of tremors felt miles away, of animals fleeing en masse, of a strange buzzing in the air that made men nauseous. He urged federal authorities to investigate, warning that settlers were terrified and local tribes believed that something unnatural had fallen from the heavens. The officer's final line was the most unsettling. If this was an act of nature, then nature itself has turned against us. The letter should have been delivered to President John Adams, but it never was. Elijah placed it, along with dozens of others, in an iron-bound trunk, assuming it was routine frontier paranoia. The trunk was sealed, misplaced during the Jefferson administration, and effectively forgotten. But the events described in those letters were real. In the early 1800s, Ohio settlers did report a night of inexplicable tremors. Decades later, local farmers discovered a crater filled with a type of iron alloy unknown to early American metallurgy. Even stranger, for nearly a century, residents near the swamp spoke of the humming ground, a faint vibration that persisted in the earth for generations. Scientists eventually attributed it to underground gases or the settling of glacial soil, but that explanation never fully satisfied locals. Some said the vibration was not natural. It pulsed, like a heartbeat. Fast forward to 1814. The British were burning Washington, D.C., and a young American officer recovering from wounds at Fort McHenry found himself reading through old clerical inventories salvaged after the destruction of federal offices. Among them was a brief note referencing Elijah Harrow's lost trunk. He became obsessed with the idea that the trunk contained sensitive intelligence related to the early years of the Republic. He believed it could hold
Samuel Norden had been working the Illinois Central Railway lines for nearly 20 years, long enough to know every sound steel rails could make, from the sharp ring of thermal expansion to the low metallic groan that came with shifting soil after a hard rain. But what he felt on that August morning in 1893 was something entirely different. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor rising through the iron track into the soles of his boots, a steady, rhythmic pulse. Not the rumbling of an approaching train, not the settling of earth. It felt alive, like the ground was breathing. Samuel crouched, pressing his ear to the rail, the sun beating down on his neck. The vibration came in waves, evenly spaced, almost like a code. Morse came to mind. He tapped the track lightly with a wrench. The vibration didn't change in response. It wasn't echoing him. It wasn't reacting. It was doing something on its own, something buried deep below that had nothing to do with the rail line above it. His coworker, a younger brakeman named Lloyd Barnes, called out from the engine cab, asking if the line was clear. Samuel hesitated before answering. He didn't believe in superstitions, but he had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories, strange, half-whispered tales about a humming ground in Ohio, stories passed down through generations since the early frontier days. His grandfather always spoke of a night when the land shook, when trees trembled like frightened animals, when the earth gave off a pulse that made men sick. A night, he said, when something fell from the sky and buried itself in the swamp. As a child, Samuel had dismissed them as old settler myths, born of isolation and fear. But now, feeling the pulse beneath him, he wondered. He waved Lloyd forward. The train moved slowly, cautiously, the wheels clacking over the rails as if the metal itself sensed something wrong. As they approached a narrow bridge spanning a dry ravine, the vibration intensified so sharply that Samuel felt it through his teeth. He signaled for Lloyd to stop. Both men climbed down and examined the track. To their horror, they watched as the iron rails began to tremble, not from the train, not from wind, but from the ground itself. The vibration had a pattern. 3 short pulses, 1 long, 2 short. Repeating. Always repeating. Within minutes, the trembling stopped. The rails fell still. The pulse vanished. The prairie around them returned to its usual stillness. Lloyd nervously joked that maybe the cicadas were having a loud day. But Samuel didn't laugh. He marked the exact time in his pocket notebook. August 11th, 1893. Unnatural vibration beneath tracks. Rhythmic. Repeating. Duration, approx 4 minutes. He mailed the note to his brother, a school teacher with interest in geology, along with a brief description of the incident, just in case it happened again. What Samuel didn't know was that similar tremors were being felt hundreds of miles away. Farmers in Indiana reported tools falling off shelves. In Kentucky, a church congregation fled mid-sermon when the pews shuddered beneath them. A telegraph operator in Ohio noted a brief disruption that caused messages to scramble into nonsense symbols for nearly 5 minutes. He later described it as a pulse in the wire, like someone tapping from inside the earth. At the time, no one linked these events together. Newspapers dismissed the tremors as minor seismic flutters, but deep in the archives of the U.S. Geological Survey, a young researcher named Oliver Cabot took notice. Cabot was quiet, methodical, and widely disliked by older geologists who viewed him as an overeager upstart. But he had one trait they didn't. He was willing to read everything. Old letters, lost reports, forgotten survey maps, frontier journals, nothing was too obscure for him. And in early September 1893, while reviewing a bundle of misfiled Civil War records, Cabot stumbled across something astonishing. A reference to the long-missing Harrow trunk and its rediscovery by Union soldiers in 1863. He read through the descriptions of tremors, strange lights, the metallic crash in Ohio, the pulsing earth reported by settlers long before the United States even had proper geological instruments. He compared those accounts with Samuel Norton's letter. He found that the pulse patterns described by early settlers bore uncanny similarity to those felt along the Illinois tracks. 3 short pulses, 1 long, 2 short. A repeating sequence. It was the same. Cabot wrote to the War Department requesting access to the Harrow papers, but his request was denied. Undeterred, he traveled to Washington on his own expense and attempted to speak directly to officials. Again, he was dismissed. Government clerks and military officers insisted the documents were irrelevant frontier gossip.
Cabot's disappearance might have gone unnoticed if not for one stubborn man, a Washington archivist named Henry Talcott. Talcott was a former Civil War quartermaster, a widower with failing eyesight, and one of the few government employees who took an interest in dusty, inconvenient papers others preferred forgotten. He had read fragments of the Harrow Trunk years earlier, during Stanton's tenure, before those files were quietly locked away again. Talcott never forgot them. So when a telegram arrived in Washington informing the War Department that Oliver Cabot, geologist, presumed missing, Talcott felt a cold recognition he could not fully explain. In his experience, people didn't just vanish on their way to Washington unless someone wanted them gone. Talcott retrieved Cabot's name from a stack of denied archive requests. He found that Cabot had repeatedly asked for access to early frontier correspondence, declassified war letters, and anything referencing unexplained seismic activity. Talcott knew exactly where those items would have been filed, because he had once been ordered to help hide them. That order had never sat well with him. So Talcott did something dangerous for a federal employee in 1893. He disobeyed a direct instruction given 30 years earlier. Quietly, after hours, he unlocked a forgotten basement room beneath the old War Office. The hinges groaned with a sound that echoed down the hall like a warning. Inside was a single iron-bound chest, the Harrow Trunk. Dust covered its surface like a burial shroud. Talcott opened it with trembling fingers. The smell of old mold and burnt paper drifted upward. Inside lay letters, hundreds of them, wrapped in faded cloth, still bearing Elijah Harrow's cramped handwriting. Talcott searched for patterns, and there they were. Tremors in the Northwest Territory, settlers reporting a metallic shriek beneath the ground, tribes describing legends of a star wound in the earth that throbbed like a living heart. Multiple letters referenced the same sequence of pulses, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. The same pattern Cabot documented. Talcott understood now why Cabot had been denied access, not because the government feared frontier superstition, but because elements within the government had known since the earliest days of the Republic that something unexplained lay beneath parts of the Midwest, something the public might panic over if revealed. Talcott copied as many letters as he could before dawn and mailed them to Cabot's last known address in Illinois, even though Cabot was already missing. Talcott did not know that Cabot's journals had been found. He did not know that federal agents were already combing train stations, boarding houses, and river docks, searching not for Cabot, but for the documents he carried. While Washington wrestled with its secrets, events in Illinois were accelerating. Samuel Norton had begun keeping detailed notes of every strange occurrence near the ravine. In late November, his notebook recorded something new, a deep rumbling beneath the soil that lasted more than 6 minutes. Samuel wrote that the sound reminded him of a massive engine trying to start. Lloyd, who had begun to dread working the stretch of track, claimed he saw dust rising in thin columns along the ravine, even though there was no wind. A third worker, an older Irish mechanic named O'Leary, refused to return to the site after he felt the ground jump beneath his feet, as though something below had struck the earth from underneath. By early December 1893, the Illinois Central Railway began receiving reports that steel components stored in trackside sheds were vibrating on their own, sometimes shifting an inch or two across wooden shelves. One night, a set of bolts slid off a table simultaneously, as if pulled by the same invisible force. Workers joked about ghosts. Samuel didn't laugh. He was beginning to believe something was happening beneath the tracks.
Samuel froze, his breath visible in the icy air as the metallic clinking grew louder, more insistent, like chains tightening beneath the earth. The sound wasn't chaotic. It had rhythm, terrifying, mechanical rhythm. Something enormous, something engineered was shifting under the ravine, as though awakening from a long, reluctant sleep. The pulse vibrated through Samuel's bones, through the steel of the track, through the very air around him. He staggered backward, eyes fixed on the trembling soil. A crack appeared in the snow-covered ground, a thin, jagged line that glowed faintly red like heated iron. The glow pulsed in time with the vibration, brightening on the long pulse, dimming on the short ones. Snow around the crack melted instantly, releasing steam that curled upward into the cold night. Before Samuel could decide whether to run or remain hidden in the shadows, he heard footsteps crunching through the snow behind him. Lloyd. Samuel swung around. Lloyd's face was pale, his breath ragged. "I knew you'd come back here. I had to see it for myself." Samuel grabbed him by the coat. "We shouldn't be here. Something's waking up under the ground." As if to answer, the crack widened with a sudden violent jerk. A burst of heat surged upward, carrying a strange metallic smell, like hot copper and oil. The glow brightened. The ground shuddered beneath their feet, harder now, almost throwing them off balance. Then came a deep, resonant hum, unlike any they had heard before. The pulse was changing. It was accelerating. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. Pause. Then again, but slightly faster. Lloyd's voice shook. "What does that mean?" Samuel didn't know, but his instincts screamed at him that this was no simple geological event. This wasn't bedrock cracking or gas escaping. This was coordinated, patterned, intentional. Something beneath them wasn't just moving, it was signaling. They backed away as the crack grew wider, spreading across the ravine floor like a fiery root system. Snow and dirt collapsed inward. Steam poured upward in thick sheets. The ground sagged as if something massive was pushing against it from below. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. The pulse vanished. The glow died. The soil settled into an eerie stillness. Silence, deep, total, suffocating, blanketed the ravine. Lloyd exhaled shakily. Maybe it's over?" Samuel didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the center of the ravine, where the glow had been brightest. A circular indentation, perfectly round, had formed in the earth. Not natural erosion, not collapse, a shape too precise to be random. A shape that looked like the top of a buried hatch. Lloyd saw it too. He took a step closer, then stopped. "Samuel, that's not possible." Samuel swallowed hard. "I don't think we're dealing with something the earth made." They left the ravine in frightened silence, agreeing to tell no one, not yet, not until they understood what they had seen. But secrets of that magnitude do not stay buried long. While Samuel and Lloyd tried to make sense of the impossible, Henry Talcott's train rolled through the midnight.
And yet, as Samuel pushed open the door to the archive room, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath his feet was shifting in ways he couldn't fully understand, as if history itself was leaning forward to watch what he would do next, and the smell of old dust and varnished wood wrapped around him like a warning, while the dim light flickered above, giving the impression that the place had been waiting not for a researcher, not for a historian, but specifically for him. And when he stepped inside, he noticed something peculiar that made the hairs on his arms rise. The room was too quiet, the air too still, as if it had been sealed off from time, and not a single page, not a single drawer, not a single filing cabinet looked like it had been touched in decades, even though Davenport had insisted the archivists maintained it regularly. And that eerie contradiction pressed against Samuel's mind like cold fingers, but he ignored it and walked toward the long wooden table in the center of the room, where a stack of files, yellowed and brittle, lay waiting. And as he reached for the topmost folder, he froze, because someone recently had pressed a thumb into the dust on the surface, leaving a clear mark, and the shape of that thumbprint wasn't his, wasn't Davenport's, wasn't any archivist's. It was too small and too sharp for a normal human thumb, like it belonged to someone with elongated bone structure or narrow digits, which made no sense. But Samuel didn't allow himself to spiral into speculation, instead opening the folder carefully, expecting to see the usual military reports, but instead he found a set of drawings, crude but detailed, depicting the Oklahoma oil rig from the story Davenport had just told him, with strange symbols drawn around the base of the rig, symbols that didn't resemble any tribal markings, military codes, or engineering notes. Symbols that looked almost like mathematical equations written by someone who didn't fully understand math, but instinctively grasped something deeper. And each line, each curve, each angle seemed to pulse with a strange energy that dug into Samuel's thoughts the longer he looked at them, making his head ache with a low, throbbing pressure. And he had to blink several times to clear his vision, but when he did, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The symbols were not drawn with pencil or ink, but with something that had seeped into the paper, leaving faint reddish-brown stains, too dark and too textured to be ink. And Samuel's stomach twisted as he wondered if this part of the story had been more literal than metaphorical. He forced himself to keep reading, turning to the next page, where he found a brittle telegram pinned to the file with a rusted paperclip, the edges crumbling like old leaves. And the telegram had been addressed to a Naval Intelligence Office in New Orleans, dated 1920, and it read only, "Subject located. Extraction impossible. Local population compromised. Requesting immediate isolation protocol." There was a second line below, barely legible. "Do not allow it to leave the ground." No signature, no sender code, nothing to identify who had written it. And Samuel felt a cold sweat prick down his back, because messages like that didn't appear in normal archives. They were usually destroyed or classified into oblivion. So the fact that this one existed at all meant someone had wanted it preserved. Someone who anticipated that decades later, someone like him would find it. He swallowed hard, turning another page. His fingers brushed the edge of the folder, and for a moment he hesitated, because something in the air felt heavier now, as if the room had subtly shifted around him, like a great hidden weight had settled over the ceiling and walls, pressing down on his lungs with invisible hands. And the silence had changed too. Not the normal hollow quiet of an empty archive, but a dense, listening silence, the kind that feels aware of you, the kind that waits to see what you will do next. And Samuel told himself he was being irrational, that he was simply exhausted or overwhelmed by the revelations piling up before him. But deep down, he knew this was different. He could feel the presence of something not visible, something ancient, something patient. As though the long-buried stories in these files were not merely records of the past, but threads connecting to a much larger force that was still alive somewhere beneath the United States, breathing rhythmically beneath plains and forests and cities. And he realized with a cold twist of unease that Davenport's warning about things America forgot on purpose might not have been metaphorical at all. He opened the next folder, the brittle cardstock whispering under his fingertips, and found a set of field sketches dated 1923, drawn by an engineering student named William Hauser, who had accompanied a geological assessment team to the Oklahoma site. And the sketches began innocently enough, measurements of soil strata, topographical outlines, but halfway through the stack, the drawings changed abruptly, almost violently, as if the artist's hand had begun shaking or his mind had snapped under some unseen pressure, because the lines became jagged and chaotic, and the shapes no longer resembled anything that belonged in a geological report. Instead, they spiraled into strange, looping forms that twisted into impossible geometry, shapes that seemed to expand outward the longer Samuel stared at them, as though they weren't drawings at all, but windows into some vast structure hidden beneath the earth. And in the margins of one sketch, the student had scrawled a desperate note. "It isn't rock, it's ribs." Samuel felt his heartbeat hammering against his ribs at the words, and the note continued with even more distress. "The ground hums when I get too close. We need to stop digging. Something is listening through the soil." He set the sketches down, breathing hard, but the next pages were even worse. Medical reports documenting Hauser's mental collapse only 6 days after returning to Kansas, describing how he ranted about tunnels of bone and caverns shaped like lungs, how he claimed to hear breathing that shakes the glass, and how he tried to warn his professors that there is more under the ground than men or oil, before he was institutionalized in Topeka, where he spent the rest of his life drawing the same looping geometric symbols over and over again until his fingers bled. Samuel rubbed his forehead, trying to steady the dizziness creeping into his vision, because he wasn't just reading these accounts, he was feeling them, as though something in the room resonated faintly with the patterns etched on those pages. And for a moment he imagined he could hear a low vibration, so faint that he couldn't tell if it came from the building or the files or his own heartbeat. And he shook his head sharply, refusing to let paranoia take root, reminding himself that he was here to uncover truth, not to...
The lights flickered again, longer this time, as if the electricity itself hesitated to remain in the room, and for a heartbeat the entire archive was plunged into darkness so complete that Samuel felt as though he had fallen into a void, suspended in a place without walls, without air, without sound. And when the lamps buzzed back to life a moment later, his breath escaped in a shaky rush. But something in the room was different now, subtly but unmistakably different, as if the brief darkness had rearranged the air, shifting the room's quiet into a deeper, heavier stillness, one that carried the faint pressure of being watched from somewhere just beyond the edges of light. He forced his focus back to the newly opened folder before him, determined not to let fear pull him away from the truth he had come so far to uncover. And the first document inside was a field communication transcript dated 1932, detailing a government inspection team that had visited the Oklahoma site after reports of tremors and inexplicable disturbances in the surrounding area. And the transcript described their arrival to find the land subtly different from the maps, sloping in the wrong direction, soil patterns inconsistent, magnetic readings erratic, and the lead inspector had noted that the earth felt hollow in unpredictable patches, as though pockets beneath the surface were shifting, expanding, contracting, breathing. Samuel blinked, his pulse quickening again at that word breathing, because it repeated like a refrain throughout every account he had read so far, and he wondered what impossible thing could leave so many people convinced that the ground itself behaved like a living organism. But the deeper he read, the less metaphorical it seemed, because the transcript went on to describe how one of the inspectors, a man named Leonard Bryce, reported hearing a low rhythmic sound while kneeling to examine a fault line. A slow, steady pulse he described as too regular to be geological, too deep to be mechanical. And he insisted it felt like something massive slumbered beneath the layers of shale, something that might stir if they made the wrong move. The transcript abruptly ended with a line scrawled in handwriting different from the rest. Team reassigned, site sealed, no further activity authorized. Samuel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with trembling hands, trying to push away the growing sense that these documents weren't simply recounting strange events, but warning him personally, almost directly, as if history had been written with him in mind. and he wanted to tell himself that was impossible, that this was just the paranoia of too many hours spent reading unsettling reports. But then he noticed the folder had another envelope tucked against the back, sealed in wax, bearing the insignia of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dating back nearly a century. And the wax had cracked slightly, as though someone had opened and resealed it long ago. He peeled it open with careful fingers, and inside he found a photographic strip, several negatives still preserved, though slightly warped with age. And he held them up to the light, squinting, and felt the breath lodge in his throat, because the images were wrong. Not just eerie or unclear, but fundamentally wrong, like fragments of a nightmare captured on film. The first negative showed the inspection team standing near the crater, except that their shadows were bent in strange angles, extending away from multiple different light sources, even though the sun was high and bright. The second showed the crater itself, not dark soil and shattered earth, but an outline of something beneath, a shape with curved ridges and smooth surfaces, unlike any natural.
Samuel froze where he stood, his fingertips hovering over the drawer handle, because the sound that came from inside wasn't vague or ambiguous anymore. It was unmistakably the muted thud of something with weight shifting, something dense, something that shouldn't be inside a filing cabinet at all. And his breath caught in his throat as he stared at the narrow slit of darkness within the half-open drawer, a darkness that suddenly seemed far deeper than the few inches of metal space should allow, as though the drawer opened not into a cabinet, but into some unseen hollow he couldn't comprehend, a deep pocket of shadow that felt impossibly vast and impossibly wrong. And every instinct inside him screamed to step back, to leave the drawer alone, to turn around and walk out of the archive forever. But curiosity held him there like an anchor. Curiosity and the heavy sense that this was not random, that the drawer had been opened for him. He swallowed hard, unable to tear his eyes away from the black gap, and after a long, dreadful moment, he forced his trembling hand forward, gripping the cold metal handle with the tips of his fingers, and he pulled. The drawer slid open smoothly, too smoothly, gliding outward with a silent grace that didn't match its rusted frame, and the motion was so fluid, so unnatural, that Samuel's breath hitched as it fully extended, revealing the contents inside. And for a heartbeat, he didn't understand what he was looking at. The drawer was empty. Completely empty. No files, no papers, no folders, nothing. But the steel bottom of the drawer wasn't flat. It bulged downward, subtly, like someone had pressed something enormous beneath it from the other side, warping the metal into a shallow curve. And Samuel leaned closer, heart pounding, trying to make sense of the deformation, when he realized with a jolt that the bulge wasn't merely dented, it pulsed. Once. A slow, deliberate downward stretch of metal, as though something beneath the thin steel had exhaled. Samuel staggered back with a strangled gasp, knocking into the table behind him, nearly sending a stack of documents spilling to the floor. And his mind raced in a tangle of denial and horror, telling him this was impossible. The motions were impossible. The breathing was impossible. But the evidence was right there before him. The cabinet drawer was rising and falling in an uneven rhythm, faint but undeniable, like the drawer was the thin membrane between him and something breathing beneath the floor. He stumbled away, chest tight, eyes locked on the drawer, as the bulge rose again, metal flexing as though under the pressure of some great unseen lung. And for several long seconds, Samuel could do nothing but stare in frozen terror, waiting to see what the next breath would bring. But after a moment, the motion stopped abruptly, the metal going still as glass. Silence flooded the room again. But it was a different silence now, charged, anticipatory, like the air had leaned in closer to hear his heartbeat. Samuel forced himself to draw a shaky breath, pushing down the panic clawing at his ribs, telling himself